aliases make it really hard for the authorities to catch up with them.
It's like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. You shut one down and another one pops up somewhere else.
Yeah, it's frustrating. But law enforcement agencies are doing their best to combat these scams. It's a tough battle.
So bringing it back to Maximilian White, do we have any concrete proof that he was involved in these scams?
Well, we have to be careful here because the information came from an anonymous source, right? But the source claimed to have first-hand knowledge of White's activities in Cyprus, Romania, and Lisbon.
And we know that Cyprus has a history of being a hotbed for boiler room activity.
Yeah, especially during that financial crisis, there was a lot of shady stuff going on.
So the timing is certainly interesting, isn't it? White was living in Cyprus during that time, and he claims to have lost millions in the banking collapse. But what if that was just a cover story?
What if it was a way to explain away any questions about where his money came from?
Right. If he was already making money from these scams, he could just say, oh, I lost it all in the crisis, and then boom, he's back in business with even more money.
Exactly. It would be a pretty clever way to launder his ill-gotten gains, wouldn't it? Make it seem like he was a victim of circumstance rather than the perpetrator.
Pretty clever, but also pretty messed up. And there are other things that make you wonder, like White always seems to be dropping financial jargon, using all these Wall Street terms.
Yeah, he's fluent in the language of finance, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Could be a sign of genuine business savvy, or maybe it's a reflection of his experience in the world of financial scams.
Right. It's like if you spend years running these boiler rooms, you're going to pick up on the lingo.
Makes sense. It's another piece of the puzzle that doesn't exactly paint him in the best light.
So we've got this potential link to boiler room scams. We've got his claims of wealth that don't really check out. We've got his strange, modest lifestyle for a supposed billionaire. And then there's the whole thing with his personality.
What do you mean?
I mean, he's always making these grandiose statements, these over-the-top gestures. He seems to crave the spotlight, the attention.
You're right, he does, doesn't he? It's almost like he needs constant validation, like he's trying to prove something to the world.
Exactly. And that makes me think, could this all be tied to some deeper psychological issue?
Like what?
Well, have you ever heard of narcissism?
Yeah, of course. But what does that have to do with Maximilian White?
Well, narcissists often have this inflated sense of self-importance, right? They need constant admiration, they have trouble handling criticism, and they can be very manipulative.
I see where you're going with this. And you think White might fit that profile?
I'm not saying he's definitely a narcissist, but there are definitely some similarities in his behavior. Think about it. Like constant bragging, the downplaying of others' achievements, the need to be the center of attention, the over-the-top gestures.
Yeah, it's all starting to make sense. Could be that this need for validation, this insecurity, is driving a lot of his actions. It's like he's built his entire identity around being this super successful billionaire.
Exactly. And if that image were to crumble, if people found out the truth, it would be devastating for him.
So maybe all these elaborate lies, all this deception, it's all just a way to protect that fragile ego.
It's a scary thought, isn't it? The lengths that someone might go to just to maintain a facade.
Is. And it makes you wonder about those boiler room allegations. If they're true, it means he was willing to hurt other people, to defraud them, just to keep up this illusion of wealth and success.
That's a dark thought. But we can't forget there's another layer of tragedy to this story. The death of his brother.
Right. Tobias White Sansom. That was a horrible incident.
It was, and White has been very vocal about getting justice for his brother, but you have to wonder, is there an element of, of image management at play here too?
It's hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, it's completely understandable that he'd be grieving, that he'd want to hold those responsible accountable. But on the other hand, it does seem like he's using this tragedy to bolster his public image.
It's tricky. It's hard to separate the genuine grief from the potential for manipulation.
It is. And it's something we need to keep in mind as we continue to unravel this story. We're dealing with a very complex individual here, someone who's both a grieving brother and a potential con artist.
It's a mess, really, and it's hard to know where the truth lies, but I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, right? It's not black and white. It's full of grays, and it forces us to really think critically about what we're seeing and hearing.
I totally agree. It's a reminder that things aren't always as they appear, and that we need to be careful about accepting things at face value.
So as we move towards wrapping up this deep dive, What do you think are the biggest takeaways from Maximilian White's story? What can we learn from this whole mess? Okay, so we're back. We've spent quite a bit of time now going through everything we could find about Maximilian White, from, those impressive claims of being a cannabis billionaire to some much darker possibilities.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, hasn't it? I mean, we started off looking at this, this entrepreneur, this supposed success story, but the more we dug, the more complicated things got.
That's for sure. It's like we started pulling on a thread and the whole sweater just started unraveling, and now we're left with, I don't know, more questions than answers, I guess.
Exactly. Like, on the one hand, you have this guy who's presenting himself as, a visionary, a self-made billionaire, but then on the other hand, there are all these inconsistencies, these red flags, these allegations that they just don't go away.
Right. So is he this brilliant entrepreneur who's being unfairly targeted, like he claims? Or is he something else entirely?
I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure. I mean, there's a real chance that the truth about Maximilian White, it might just stay hidden.
And that's kind of scary when you think about it. I mean, it makes you realize how easy it can be to be fooled, to be misled.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially these days, right? With so much information out there, so much noise, it's hard to know what to believe, who to trust.
That's why it's more important than ever to be, I don't know, to be a critical thinker, right? To not just take things at face value.
Totally agree. You gotta question everything. You gotta look for evidence, look for proof. You gotta think for yourself.
Because, I mean, we live in a world where image is everything. People are so quick to judge based on appearances, on how someone presents themselves.
Right. Like social media, it's all about projecting this perfect image.
Yeah.
But you never know. You never know what's really going on behind the scenes.
And that's what we've learned from this whole Maximilian White deep dive, I think. That things are not always what they seem.
Definitely. And that you gotta be careful. You gotta be skeptical. You gotta do your homework, before you believe something, before you trust someone.
So what can we do to protect ourselves from being misled, from falling for these elaborate lies?
Well, first off, I think it's important to develop a healthy sense of skepticism. Like, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't just accept something because someone, who seems important or successful said it.
Okay, so question everything. What else?
Look for inconsistencies,
Mm-hmm.
Like we saw with White, there were all these things that they just didn't add up. His claims about his wealth, his lifestyle, his past, it just didn't make sense.
Right. The pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit together. So if you see those kinds of red flags, those contradictions, it's a sign that maybe there's more to the story than what's being presented.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to do your own research, There's so much information available online from reputable sources. Take the time to verify things, to fact check things.
That's good advice. And I think it's important to remember that we all have our own biases, right? We all come to things with our own preconceived notions.
Absolutely. And those biases can really cloud our judgment. So it's important to be aware of them, to try to be as objective as possible when evaluating information.
That's a good point. It's like we need to constantly be checking ourselves, making sure we're not letting our emotions, our preconceptions get in the way of seeing things clearly.
Exactly. So skepticism, checking for inconsistencies, doing your own research, being aware of your biases. Those are, I think, some of the key takeaways from this whole Maximilian White saga.
Okay, so that's the toolkit, right? That's how we can protect ourselves from being misled. But what about Maximilian White himself? What's the final verdict on him? Is he a visionary, a con man, or somewhere in between?
I wish I had a definitive answer for you, but the truth is I just don't know. I think we've presented all the information we could find, all the evidence, all the contradictions, and now it's up to each individual to decide for themselves what they believe.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We didn't set out to put White on trial or anything. Our goal was to explore his story, to try to understand who he is, what he's about, and to help our listeners learn how to think critically, to evaluate information for themselves.
And I think we've done that. So, yeah, maybe we don't have all the answers, but I think we've raised some important questions, and hopefully we've given our listeners some food for thought.
I think so too. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Maximilian White. It's been quite a journey, but like we always say, stay curious, Keep asking questions and never stop digging deeper.
Couldn't have said it better myself.